The pink line is a new global human rights frontier that has a geopolitical definition. There are some countries or people who see themselves on one side of the pink line, which is about expanding the definition of universal human rights to provide protection and dignity to people regardless of their sexual orientation and gender identity. And on that side of the pink line, you might put Europe, the European Union. On the other side of the pink line are countries or leaders or faith institutions, churches, who believe that this very notion of expanding the pink line threatens their own quote unquote cultural sovereignty or traditional values. I quote in my book one of the Ayatollahs from Iran saying that, you know, what we really have to fight now is not an assault from the West with arms, but a cultural assault, an assault that is stealing our children with these new ideas. And this is all, whether it's coming from the Kaczynskis in Poland or from the Ayatollahs in Iran or from any others of these leaders, is what I call a kind of sovereignty anxiety. An anxiety about, if you're a patriarch or a president or a priest, an anxiety about your ability to control your flock at a time when, frankly, they are uncontrollable. In the way I understand the world, identity politics and class politics are very intertwined. I think I would also say that I believe that class politics are a form of identity politics too.
Hello all, my name is Grzegorz Jankowicz and I work as program director of the Konrad Festival, international literary event organized in Krakow. This is our fourth interview that belongs to a year-long series of events, of conversations titled The Nature of the Future. One of the aims we want to achieve by launching this series is to contextualize the most important notions, themes, phenomena of this year's edition of the festival. My guest today is Mark Gevisser. Hello, Mark.
Nice to be with you, Jacob.
Mark Gevisser is a writer, journalist, and LGBTQ+ activist and author of several books. He was born in South Africa, and after completing studies in the US, after graduating from Yale University, he was working for a few years as a journalist in America, cooperating with different journals. Later, he came back to South Africa, to his country, and now he lives in Cape Town. His last book, The Pink Line, Journeys Across the World's Queer Frontiers, published in 2020, will be released in Poland in a couple of months. The title of this interview, of this conversation, is on human rights, and I'm going to discuss this topic with Mark in various contexts brought by Mark in the Pink Line. Mark, thank you once again for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for having me, and it's very wonderful to be engaging with a Polish audience and anticipating having Polish readers, given how vital these issues are in Polish society at the moment.
You start your book with an epigraph from James Baldwin. It goes like this: an identity is questioned only when the mighty begin to fall, or when the wretched begin to rise, or when the stranger enters the gates. What strikes me in this fragment is the word only. From Baldwin's perspective, the essay was written in, I guess, 1976 or 7. An identity is questioned only at certain occasions, only sometimes. It seems that today it is questioned in one way or the other all the time.
That's a fascinating observation. Yes, certainly when Baldwin wrote those words in an essay in 1976, there was not the dominance of what we have come to call identity politics in the world today. But I think one of the reasons why I chose that epigraph is because I do think it remains true. I think that we only think of our identities or are forced to think of our identities when there's some kind of shift in social or political or cultural norms or conventions. And perhaps one of the reasons why this thing called identity politics has become so dominant in our world today is because of the rapidity of these shifts, given globalization, given the way people move as never before, given the way information travels as never before due to the digital revolution. So there are many more moments or provocations for identities, for us to question our own identities, or for others to question our identities, than there would have perhaps been a generation or two back.
You write that in recent years, two first decades of 20th century, there emerged a new frontier of human rights. What is this frontier you call the pink line, and how does it challenge the previous concepts of human rights?
Well, I suppose I became very clear, very conscious as a gay man who sort of came out at roughly the time that James Baldwin wrote those words, sort of late 70s, early 80s. I became very conscious of how the world was changing in ways that I couldn't have imagined when I came out. Whether it was about the ability for me to marry my husband. South Africa was the 5th country in the world to permit same-sex marriage. Whether it's about people being able to say for themselves what their gender identity is. There was a new global conversation that was happening. And it seemed to me that this global conversation was creating a new human rights frontier. And that this human rights frontier, which in my book I call the pink line, has come to describe and define and even divide, and you'll know this, you'll really understand this concept of divide the world as never before. In Poland, you understand this concept of divide around notions of sexual orientation and gender identity. So the pink line is a new global human rights frontier that has a geopolitical definition. There are some countries or people who see themselves on one side of the pink line, which is about expanding the definition of universal human rights to provide protection and dignity to people regardless of their sexual orientation and gender identity. And on that side of the pink line, you might put Europe, the European Union. On the other side of the pink line are countries or leaders or faith institutions, churches, who believe that this very notion of expanding the pink line threatens their own quote unquote cultural sovereignty or traditional values. And so not only do they exclude themselves from what's happening on the other side of the pink line, but they attempt to put up the barriers even higher against these forces allegedly from the other side of the pink line. And that, of course, is exactly what the ruling party in Poland did in last year's election, when it went on this assault against LGBT ideology. It's exactly what Viktor Orban is doing in Hungary right now, as he passes legislation forbidding the promotion of homosexuality in the classroom. It's what Putin did in Russia. It's what many African leaders have done as they have passed legislation that actually increases the criminalization against LGBTQ or queer people, almost as a backlash against what they believe is this assault, this neo-imperialist assault coming from the other side of the pink line.
In February of 2020, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres noted in his speech that the digital age has opened a new frontiers of human rights. What is clear from your book is that all changes caused by LGBTQ plus movements were strongly related to new technologies, new ways of global communications. Could you reflect upon it?
Absolutely. Well, you know, I can reflect to begin with personally, which is that when I came out in the 1980s, or when let's not say came out, when I came to understand myself as having a homosexual identity or a gay identity in the 1980s, I did so alone. You know, maybe there were some lines in a book, you know, on my parents' library. In fact, it was Kraft Ebbing's Psychopathia Sexualis, you know, where I read about my sexuality as a pathology. That's how I first came to understand myself as gay, and that's true for almost anybody of my generation. And every single person I met researching this book, The Pink Line, all over the world, even in a remote Indian village where only one person had a smartphone and had access to broadband, every single person I met who identifies themselves as somewhere on the LGBTQ alphabet had been assisted in this identification by going online and through the digital revolution. And really, when we want to understand, Barack Obama, for example, when he finally came out in favor of same-sex marriage, said that no social movement had happened as quickly as the movement for LGBTQ rights. And I think he's right. And he's right precisely because of the forces of globalization of this era, and specifically because of the digital revolution, because of the way that if you have one of these and a little bit of broadband and a little bit of privacy, no matter where you are, no matter what the conditions are around you that might be against your ability to express yourself for who you are, unless, of course, you're in China where there's a great firewall. But as long as you've got one of these, you can log on to a kind of global network and exchange of ideas and of information and of people like you. And you can develop, in some ways, a somewhat globalized identity around your sexual orientation or gender identity, or many other things around your religion too, from the other side. Because at the same time as LGBTQ people are doing this with their phones, so too are conservative right-wing people, which is why there is so much similarity between the homophobic politics in a country like Poland and a country like Nigeria and a country like the United States.
As you said, the pink line is drawn between places integrating LGBTQ people into their societies as full subjects of human rights, and those places finding new ways of rejecting or even criminalizing them. But
yeah, I think so if you don't mind, Gregor, if I can just qualify that, particularly speaking to a Polish audience, you in Poland would know better than anybody that these pink lines are not only drawn between countries, but they go through countries too. If you look at how the PIS election campaign sought to divide the Polish population, and how such a minority, but a very significant minority of people decided to vote for the mayor of Warsaw, despite the fact that he was branded by the other side as being pro-gay rights. you can see how these pink lines are not necessarily between countries, but through countries, through communities as well.
Absolutely, through families as well, of course.
Families too, yeah.
One important aspect of the struggle is, that's how I see it, is a tension between global and local processes. In many countries, in Poland too, anti-LGBTQ legislation is used as a barrier against globalization. How do you see this problem?
Well, I think that we have this area of globalization, as I've described, where ideas and commodities and people travel as never before. Maybe not people so much in the pandemic, but and hopefully not so much so that we can begin to fight global warming. But nonetheless, what's happened in this era is that a certain kind of populist nativist leadership has tried to erect barriers against this globalization so that they can continue to exert authority over people who they feel they have lost. And you know that I quote in my book one of the ayatollahs from Iran saying that, you know, what we really have to fight now is not an assault from the West with arms, but a cultural assault, an assault that is stealing our children with these new ideas. And this is all, whether it's coming from the Kaczynskis in Poland or from the ayatollahs in Iran or from any others of these leaders, is what I call a kind of sovereignty anxiety. An anxiety about, if you're a patriarch or a president or a priest, an anxiety about your ability to control your flock at a time when, frankly, they are uncontrollable. So I think that's a really important phenomenon. And in fact, I cite an activist from the Ukraine, a woman named Lena Shevchenko, who even among the left during the time of the Ukrainian Revolution, when everyone was going on to the Maidan, her own comrades in the revolution were saying to her, maybe we shouldn't have the rainbow flag on the Maidan in Kiev. Ukrainians aren't ready for this yet. Can you keep the rainbow flag off the Maidan? And Lena said, and I quote her in my book, you know, I agree with you, she said to her comrades, I agree with you. Ukrainians are not ready for this yet, but there's nothing we can do about it because Ukrainian queer people themselves travel, they go online, they see what freedoms are available in other parts of the world. They see what it means to be able to exercise what one might call personal autonomy. And really, we don't have much control in stopping that. So we have to accept that as a condition of our contemporary world. And what we see in this resistance to the acceptance of these rights is an inability or an unwillingness to accept this as a condition of our contemporary world.
At certain point of your book, you put together two political statements, political expressions. One of them is by Shevchenko.
Yeah, as I just said.
She said, the world is moving so fast, we have no choice but to try and catch up.
Yeah.
And the other expression is by Macky Sall, former president of Senegal, who said that we live in a world that is changing slowly. And you ask a question, which statement is correct? And the answer is absolutely great, both of them actually. But how is it possible that both these opinions, both statements are correct? How do you see it?
Well, I think the immediate and obvious answer is once more this little machine, because the world moves really quickly when you're here, and you put this down and you walk into the street, and the world is moving very slowly again. And what I write about is how, particularly for queer people who live on the pink line, in countries like Ukraine, in countries like Senegal, perhaps in countries like Poland, there is this constant shuttle between time zones, between a world that's moving quickly and a world that's moving slowly, between an online globalized experience and an offline experience. What happens when you look up from your cell phone into the eyes of a recriminating parent, into the eyes of a church that says you're a sinner, into the eyes of a state that says what you're doing is something illegal. And the experience of living in these two time zones, I think, makes queer life particularly complicated in this era. In many ways, there is a new kind of condition of dizziness, of dislocation, that perhaps didn't exist when your whole identity needed to be on the down low, where you had a way of where everything was kind of repressed, and you lived a public life that was somewhat different to your repressed private life, but without this ability to move into an area where you might feel liberation. And let's just say this isn't just about these two time zones, are not just about between being online and offline. If I can go back to Poland again, you look at that map of hate that Polish activists did around the time of so-called LGBT-free zones. And you see that very close to Warsaw, in a very very close part of the country, there is an area where what might be acceptable in the capital is not acceptable in the countryside. So these two time zones not only divide the online from the offline, but they also divide the rural from the urban. And even within that area it was fascinating for me to read, even within that area of southeast Poland, which is apparently, the hate zone. Of course, there are cities where there are very active LGBTQ communities. So the world is a very complicated place when it comes to these issues and the speed at which different people have moved.
People drive their stories. The rest of us, activists and policymakers, all others, try to catch up. These are your words. You always start in this book with individual story, with a person. There is no one perspective in your book. There are various points of view and ways of challenging, creating, and affirming different identities. This is a very powerful aspect of this narrative.
No, thank you for that observation, Jago. I suppose as a journalist, and as a journalist who kind of came of age writing about the transition, the South African transition from apartheid to democracy, a very confusing time in the late 80s and early 90s. I came to understand that the best way as a journalist of understanding political transition or social transition was to sit on the shoulder of somebody experiencing that transition and to see the world the way they did. Because of the way, anyone who reads fiction will know this, because of the way a protagonist helps you understand a story, really. A protagonist gives you the best possible narrative arc through the sort of infinite swamp that is the world, if you like. Now, if that's an approach that I've always had to writing. It is my narrative credo. But it felt even more important with this book to obey that credo. Why? Because the politics of the pink line mean that queer people are told who they are from either side. From the one side, they're told, "Oh, you are a foreign agent. You are you are an agent of this imperialism. You've got the devil inside you. You've got George Soros inside you. You've got Brussels inside you. You've got Washington inside you. You are not who you are. You have been invaded by other forces." On the other side of the pink line, if you're told, if you come, say, for example, from a country like Russia or from many African countries, you're seen as victims who need to be saved. So you're either seen as victims who need to be saved, or you're seen as foreign enemy agents. And in that context, it seemed absolutely critical for me, not just to acknowledge, but to value the agency of the people I was writing about, their agency in the world. And that seems to me to be the kind of the very at the very core of any human rights regime, is acknowledging the agency of others. And really, so for both ethical and creative reasons, I write through people and about people and from their perspectives, but never pretending that I'm not also there as a person, because I think that's another key part of this construct, which is not to pretend that I'm some sort of omniscient viewpoint, or not even to appropriate other people's voices, but to establish myself as your guide, as the reader to these people's voices and experiences, and to acknowledge where appropriate that I come from somewhere too, that I'm a white, middle-class, gay, Jewish man who has certain privileges, and that if I'm talking about the way that there are vectors of globalization that provoke these politics along the pink line, that when I go to a small village in India, or when I go to Kampala to meet a Ugandan queer person who has been victimized, I am one of those vectors of globalization. I carry my ideas in my backpack, and I carry money in my wallet. And whether I use that money or not, I'm perceived as having that money. And one of the things that's always said from the other side of the pink line about people like me is that we pay the other side to be gay. So I have to acknowledge that the West is paying LGBT activists in Poland or in Russia or in Uganda to be gay. Now, I'm not paying anyone to be gay, obviously, and I'm not using that money in my wallet necessarily, but I do have it there in comparison with the people I'm meeting, and I need to acknowledge that. So I never write myself out of the story. I am present as well.
You quote a famous line by Harvey Milk, who addressed LGBTQ people, encouraging them to come out because their visibility could change the situation. It was his idea, his way of changing American society. And we tend to think that it got changed in America. Yet most individuals who asked you for anonymity came from the US. What does it tell us about social changes in America and elsewhere?
I found that astonishing myself. I mean, I think that the big picture is true, that visibility really does make the biggest difference in shifting societies. So I think that must be said. But at the same time, we need to acknowledge that in some countries and in some contexts, visibility is very difficult and very dangerous. And visibility can can really cause terrible violence. And therefore, the American model, San Francisco, look, there's violence against people who become visible in the United States, particularly transgender people of color. But in societies with greater histories of violence, contemporary, there might be more danger. And therefore, you cannot take the Harvey Milk motto and apply it indiscriminately everywhere. Nonetheless, there's no doubt in my mind from my experience that as people come out, whatever the difficulty, society changes because the people around them come to see that that the homosexual or the transgender is not the other, that the homosexual or the transgender is your child, your neighbor, your partner, your postman, your butcher, whatever. And that has a really powerful effect. So that's the general concept. As to your question about the United States and all these people asking for anonymity, I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about that. And I think there are many reasons for that. I think it says something about how in some respects in American society, what we call identity politics has tipped over the edge into what is called cancel culture. And a lot of this has to do with social media. So the young people I was interviewing in the United States were anxious that they might be criticized. I don't think that many of them were anxious about being out to those who might be considered right-wing. I think they were anxious about what others in the LGBTQ community might think about them if, for example, they had been transgender and then detransitioned back to femininity. I also think it has to do with the way that Americans are particularly media savvy and therefore understand that if they get named in a certain way now, it's going to follow them for the rest of their lives. In a way that a villager in India might not think about in the same way. But I think it says something about how awkward and sensitive these politics have become in the United States, even as, of course, there have been huge advances there when it comes to LGBTQ rights.
You write that LGBTQ rights are seen in certain countries and by certain governments as logical application of the United Nations 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But there are radical activists who suggest that a logical application of existing human rights is not enough, that we need a completely new formulation of rights to protect all human and other beings, non-human beings. What do you think about such claims?
I find such claims really interesting, and theoretically, I'm supportive of them. But I guess I'm a journalist, not a polemicist, or an ideologist, and my job is to see the world as it is, not as I want it to be. So I sort of alight from that perspective when I do my work. And I understand as well, perhaps from a different perspective, the limitations of a notion of universal human rights that come from a particular liberal Western conception of individual rights and individual freedoms. And one of the things that was really interesting to track in my work is what happens when that conception comes into contact with other epistemologies, with other ways of understanding who you are in the world. and to see how in the world these liberal notions of individual rights, which are at the basis of any claim for rights on the basis of your sexual orientation or gender identity, what happens to those notions as they are diffused or as they are downloaded by people into societies that have perhaps more communal understandings of what it means to be human.
The changes you discuss in your book created new categories of people demanding rights and moral panic. The other effect is moral panic, as you say. I guess this moral panic is one of the reasons why certain governments are so successful in controlling societies by launching their anti-LGBTQ politics. What to do with this panic? How to communicate with those who got panicked?
I mean, in a way, I think I've begun to answer that already when I speak about the importance of visibility, and really, what I found most interesting and inspiring in all the work I've done around this topic is to see how, even in the most adverse of environments, the people I write about, all of whom have come out in one way or another, have islands of acceptance around them. The people who know them and love them. Not necessarily their biological families, it must be said. Sometimes they've been thrown out of their biological families, but the people who know them and love them and engage with them on an everyday basis. And for me, it seems that the most powerful forces in diffusing the panic are those who say is the Irish farmer and his wife, who say, elderly, gray-haired Catholic people who say during the Irish referendum on whether same-sex marriage should be made legal, who say, our son is gay and we love him. Why should he not have the same happiness and acceptance as our son who is straight, when we love them equally and they both love their partners equally? Nothing is more powerful than those organizations of parents and families of LGBTQ people advocating on their behalf. I've seen it in India, where the families of LGBTQ people made a petition to the Supreme Court for the decriminalization of homosexuality. I've seen it in Turkey and in many African countries where they've argued within churches or within community forums. And it's not just families; it's religious leaders too. It's colleagues in the workplace. For example, we can talk about, I think we will talk about, the effects of capitalism on all of this. But what's been fascinating is what's happened as a consequence of multinational corporations setting up shop in environments like India or African countries, and how affinity groups in these corporations and in companies like Google or the big investment banks create space for allies to join these affinity groups, like in Google, the Gayglers, they're called. And this creates space for colleagues in the workplace to talk about it and to and perhaps even if you're not gay yourself, to give cover to those of your colleagues who are. And all of these are very, very powerful tools against this moral. The best way for Poland, for Polish people, to fight the moral panic that is kindled by right-wing Polish politicians is to stand up themselves and to say, we are gay, we are transgender, or our children are gay, or our favorite writers are gay, or our politicians are gay or transgender, rather than for people outside of Poland to advocate on their behalf. Because that just makes the moral panic higher, because then the Kaczynskis or the Orbans can say, yes, you see, we told you so. This is something that Brussels wants. So for me, that's the answer to the question.
There is a very interesting story you tell by a writer, Meredith Talusan, who told you that she wouldn't have transitioned if she stayed in the Philippines. She was born in the Philippines, where she had a lot of ways of expressing her femininity as a man. But when she came to the States to study there, she found a binary system in which she could be only a woman or a man. Since she didn't fit neatly in man gender, she transitioned into woman.
Yeah, I found that story absolutely fascinating, and it says something to me, something I saw that's very prevalent and a major theme of my book, is about how there are these different conceptions of gender identity in different parts of the world. So in the Philippines, there is this category of people called bakla. And bakla are male-bodied but feminine people. They use the she pronoun sometimes, the he pronoun sometimes. It's a kind of fluid middle ground, right? And there would have been room for Meredith to not go through a full social or medical transition in the Philippines and to be bakla. But and when she came to the United States, there really wasn't that kind of opportunity. But what's interesting and complex is that that even though there is that space in Philippine society to be bakla, and it's a space that's not only very significant but very cherished. Bakla are a very significant part of Filipino society and are generally very accepted and loved and have a role to play. But they have a role to play, but it's a very circumscribed role. And that role is in the beauty industry, really. If you are bakla, that is what you do. You're a beautician, you're a hairdresser, that's it. And so Meredith might have been able to remain bakla and not transition to femininity, but she would have been very circumscribed in what her life would have been. What's fascinating is when a globalized transgender movement comes along, and when transgender activists in the Philippines say to bakla people, you know, you don't need to stay in this middle ground. In this middle ground that condemns you or limits you to a life as a beautician. You can transition to femininity fully. You can have surgery that makes you into a woman. You can live in the world as a woman, and then you can be anything. In fact, there is a transgender congresswoman in the Philippines. There are transgender academics in the Philippines. And that is the power of the transgender rights movement in countries like the Philippines and India, is that they bring the sense of possibility. But the cost of it, and I think we need to understand this, that the cost of it is that what was formerly a more fluid notion of gender, what was more of a spectrum, becomes more binarist, right? So that space for people who feel themselves to be in the middle, for society to have some sort of conception of a third gender, becomes limited by these Western binarist notions. And that is what I saw happening in the Philippines and in India. And I think that's interesting and important to observe and to note. And I don't yet know, I don't think we know how this is going to play out, what things are going to look like for bakla in the Philippines, or katui in Thailand, or hijras in India in a generation's time. but it's something that is changing.
You make a very important point. It's related to what you have just said, that these countries where there had always been third gender identities, be it Philippines or India, when they encounter transgender revolution, they change their attitude towards gender identity. New pink lines are being created in these spaces.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, it's fascinating to see what's happening in India, for example, where as a result of a new global transgender movement and the way people have come to see themselves as transgender rather than just hijra, how that's shifting their sense of self. You know, hijra is a cultural identity and it's a religious identity. Transgender is a political identity. It's an identity that you use to claim for rights, and it's also a biomedical identity. It's an identity that goes hand in hand with the kind of medical transition that is now available. So the hijras, the hijras are a huge community of third gender people. But what's been very interesting to see in India is the way there is now a battle among people who see themselves as transgender as to who should have transgender rights. And these rights could potentially very significant in India, because the Indian Supreme Court has ruled that there needs to be affirmative action for transgender people. You know, so in terms of jobs, housing, all of that. Now, hijras say that to get that affirmative action, to qualify as transgender and get those benefits, you need to have been male-bodied and transitioned to femininity, because those are the people who are stigmatized in their society. And sometimes they even say, well, you know, you need to have undergone surgical transition and been castrated, otherwise you're not entitled to these rights. And there's a different conception of personal autonomy that comes from the West that is about self-determination, that says, you know, I am who I say I am. And if I say I am a woman, even if I don't have that surgery, I am a woman and I need to be acknowledged as a woman. And there are new battles about that in Indian society that are transforming the debate.
There was, and there is, probably there will be, a tension between those who focus on identity politics and those who think that the most important goal is a critique of capitalism. Of course, those positions don't have to exclude each other, but sometimes they do exclude each other massively. Those who fight with capitalism claim that the latter is adjustable and can utilize any identity politics. There is a story about IKEA commercial in your book. In this commercial, a homosexual couple, a couple of two women, presents their family with children in a flat furnished with IKEA products. The commercial was cut off from Russian catalog of IKEA because it would bother consumers there. So here it is, capitalism using identity politics to play with consumers.
Sure. I mean, I think that's an absolutely accurate description of how capitalism works. And I suppose as somebody who's observed this rights movement grow globally, I really do pay attention to how one of the vectors of globalization that has spread the word of LGBTQ rights is global commodity capitalism. No question about it. I mean, I've already spoken about the multinational corporations. I also give the example in a chapter about gay cruise ships that arrive on Caribbean islands where homosexuality is illegal, and the kind of conflict, but also possibility that comes out of that for queer people who live on an island like Dominica or Barbados, when this gay cruise ship full of wealthy gay men who've paid money to go on this cruise arrive on their little island. I also looked very powerfully, I hope it's powerful, I felt it powerfully, at the terrible poverty of many of the people I write about in countries like India and Malawi and Uganda. And that poverty is, or maybe not the poverty itself, but the inequality in this world between the gay man on the cruise ship and the poor person in the island he's visiting is very much a consequence of capitalism. And the life for people who are poor as that consequence, the ability to express themselves in terms of their sexual orientation or gender identity is so much harder because they are poor. Because one of the things about having wealth is that you can buy your space and your privacy. You don't have that sort of space or privacy when you're poor. So all of which is to say that as you said, in the way I understand the world, identity politics and class politics are very intertwined. I think I would also say that I believe that class politics are a form of identity politics too. I mean, if one looks at the way in Marxist theory, there are people who identify themselves as proletarian, and there are other people who are told that they are kulaks or petty bourgeoisie. I mean, all of those are identities. They're identities based on economic position rather than necessarily on race, gender, or sexuality or nationality. But any political system that is about claiming rights on the basis of who you are is a system that is based on identity politics.
Mark, what are the most important lessons about the current situations of LGBTQ people you gained during the journeys across the world's queer frontier? Could you sum it up to give us an overall picture?
I mean, it's hard to, but I think that there are a few things. The first is, very importantly, that there is not one way in the world that people express gender identity and sexual orientation, and there is not one path in the world for how people become free on the basis of their sexual orientation and gender identity. And that needs to be understood, particularly by those in the West, that the path taken that includes pride parades and same-sex marriage is not necessarily the path that's going to be taken in the same way and at the same speed in other parts of the world. And that even as somebody reading my book in a country where the issue seems to be sorted, there's somebody on the other side of the pink line who really, for whom the situation has perhaps even become worse. So that's one of the important things that I learned. Another important thing I learned, I think, is the power of agency, and the kind of inspiration I got and that I saw from people who, despite all of this, insist on being themselves and on living their lives according to their truths, and even when that is very difficult. That there are an increasing number of people who do that. And that is linked to, I think, what I said before about the power of visibility. But then the third and perhaps most important thing I learned is that it doesn't necessarily follow smoothly that, as Martin Luther King said, the long arc of history bends towards justice. It may well, but what I see much more, particularly in this sphere, is something of a pendulum. Because when rights are claimed, when space is claimed, there's backlash. And even if we look at Poland, you know Poland better than I do. I don't know Poland well at all, so forgive me if I have this wrong. But so much of what happened last year was a backlash against the space that was claimed by queer people, particularly in Warsaw and in the cities. You know, the LGBT plus declaration that Trzaskowski was impelled to sign was an initiative that came from queer people in Warsaw themselves. They were claiming space in Polish society that wasn't there before. And not just social space, but political space. And it's political space that's so threatening. And once the space had been claimed, if the right wing is looking for a way to mobilize, it will use that space in a form of backlash. And that is the pendulum that I see swinging, and that we need to understand that pendulum will swing. That doesn't mean that the long arc isn't bending, but along the way, the pendulum is swinging.
And how do you see the future? What kind of dynamics, social and political, do you see around the pink line in close and distant future?
I think what I've just said is I see a pendulum swinging of space being claimed and backlash. And as a result of the backlash, stronger space being claimed. You know, I think that it is very interesting to note the way in the United States, the gay rights movement strengthened enormously in the 1970s as a consequence of right-wing conservatives legislating against the promotion of homosexuality in schools, because this caused such outrage among many other people. And that caused something of a backlash against the backlash. So that is going to happen. I think the other thing that's going to happen, and it's already starting to happen, but what I hope happens more quickly, is a dissolving of the pink line, and particularly a dissolving of the geopolitical tracking of the pink line over old borders. So the way the pink line is tracked over the Iron Curtain that used to separate the West from the East, or the way the pink line is tracked over the line between the former colonial master and post-colonial countries in Africa. To see that line dissolving as more countries and societies in Africa or in Eastern Europe or in Asia begin to change is I think going to be very interesting, so that it stops being seen as a kind of West versus the rest thing, which it really isn't. If you did a scan of which countries are the most progressive when it comes to LGBTQ rights, on paper at least, in that list is Argentina, is Nepal, is South Africa, is in Africa, other African countries as well, Mauritius. It's not nearly as clear as the ideologues would like it to, would have us believe it is.
Mark, thank you for sharing your thoughts with me and our audience. Hope we'll see each other in October during your trip to Europe. Dear all, next month I will interview Andrzej Marzec, philosopher, who wrote a book titled Anthropo-Shadow, about a massive influence of humankind upon the world and other beings. We'll talk about the future. How can we envision the better future of the world without Anthropo-Shadow cast by humankind on it? Last Thursday of September, please remember this date. Be with us, be with Conrad Festival. Mark, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jago, for having me.